Welcome to the Empty World podcast, the space where we normalize conversations on post-growth, planetary boundaries, and the well-being economy. I'm your host, Gabriel Bonamy, and today we're exploring business sustainability with Cambridge University's own Professor Chris Marquis. Professor Marquis is the Sinyi Professor at the Cambridge Judge School of Business. His research and teaching focus on the intersection of business, society, and sustainability, exploring how corporations, governments, and civil society can work together to address major global challenges like climate change and inequality. He is the author of several acclaimed books, including The Profiteers and Better Business, and previously held academic positions at Cornell and Harvard. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Professor Marquis, thank you so much for joining me. I came across your work last year, your Harvard Business Review article, In Defense of Degrowth. And what struck me is that you're tackling something we just don't hear enough about in mainstream economics. The idea that maybe we need to fundamentally rethink how our economic system works. And even here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I'm recording this episode, these conversations are still pretty rare in academic spaces. So to start us off, how did you get into this work? What drew you to degrowth? And what made you decide to write about it?
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Gabrielle, for having me on. Really looking forward to our discussion. And I must say, Cambridge, UK, also these topics are, not necessarily mainstream. So it's good to have this chance for us to dialogue and hopefully expose more people to these ideas. So my professional arc, so to speak, is not what you would think from someone who necessarily is focusing on, more critical perspectives on business and sustainability around degrowth. So I have worked for most of my academic career at business schools, leading business schools. I'm now at Cambridge. I had spent also, a lot of time in Cambridge, Massachusetts as well. I was at Harvard University for 12 years at the business school, and then for a bit of time at the Kennedy School, and also at Cornell. And in that work, major business schools, you're sort of in the belly of the capitalist beast, so to speak. I mean, these are institutions that are really very much set up to train the future leaders of the largest financial or corporate actors. And so within all of them, there is a deep sort of free market neoliberal orientation. I mean, the students come there to get a credential and make a lot of money. So I guess it's not that surprising. And the faculty too, I mean, I think that there's a surprising amount of critical faculty and faculty that believe that business really has a responsibility to leave the world better than they found it. But a large portion of the faculty were sort of socialized into mainstream economic thinking, which doesn't take things like degrowth or even the fact that companies have a responsibility beyond the bottom line very seriously. And I think being in that environment, being exposed to the students, teaching on sustainability concepts, I came to realize that the world was getting worse and worse despite all the sort of things we were teaching the students about how they can make it better. And so it really made me reflect a bit on what are some of the fundamental underlying assumptions of these models that think about how to reorient the capitalist system. And many of them, I think, are distractions at best, trying to say, look, here, we're doing this thing that looks very good, but actually that's a way to deflect attention from maybe some deeper issues. So that's a bit about, my general journey, and looking forward to talking more.
Yeah, the greenwashing piece is striking. It sounds like that was a real inflection point for you, seeing companies adopt the language of sustainability without the substance. How did you come to understand that gap? What made you realize that the problem wasn't just about doing sustainability better, but that maybe the whole framework we're using is off?
Over these last number of years in particular, I've become much more skeptical of a lot of the things I taught early. I think there is predominant in all of business and business schools, certainly this idea of sort of the win-win, where companies can serve the planet and society and they can make money off of it. And so as a result, we can all sort of sing kumbaya because business through their self-interest is gonna save us. I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek and exaggerated there, but I do think that is a pretty predominant set of thoughts. And early in my career, the classes I taught were oriented towards that. I think one of the things that really helped me change my perspective. So one was this business roundtable. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it was in 2019, the Business Roundtable, which is this organization of about 200 leading U.S. organizations, like the largest companies in America. It's a trade organization. And what they do, I mean, is basically lobby for tax cuts, lobby for favorable regulation. They're deeply embedded with the Trump administration and involved in the tax cuts that passed earlier, recording in the fall of 2025. So they came out with this statement that businesses should be responsive to all stakeholders, and that stakeholder management should be the core focus of businesses, not short-term profit, but a focus on stakeholders. I mean, this got like front page New York Times coverage. It got like the amount of press this got. And I can't say, a lot of the work, sort of academic research I've done, even though some of my teaching was maybe embedded a little bit in the companies can do well by do good, win-win logic. Actually, much of my academic research was a little more skeptical, focusing on how a lot of the work that companies are doing is actually greenwashing. And we really need much more stringent scrutiny from government, from civil society, to make sure that companies actually deliver on what they claim and hold them accountable in a more rigorous way. So I can't say that I was necessarily super optimistic that the Business Roundtable companies were going to do better. There was a little bit of optimism in me that maybe because this is getting so much press, the depth of the commitment in our culture to neoliberal shareholder first ideas, maybe people start to question that. I think that's happened. But after a few years, maybe 3 years or so, research from journalists, from academics started to come out that actually looked at Business Roundtable companies, sort of following this statement. The problem with putting a stake in the ground is that people can check if you actually rigorously and authentically follow through on it. And it turns out The Guardian had a great investigation. I think Business Week did a number of really strong academic papers. And basically, these companies did not follow through on things. And in fact, one of the pretty rigorous economics papers that has investigated this found that actually Business Roundtable companies, after signing onto the statement, did worse in carbon emissions, labor standards, get more environmental penalties, et cetera. A paper that I read that was on this said that this was potentially like a case of moral licensing. Moral licensing is an individual level concept where if you do something good, you feel like it's okay to do something bad. The example I always give when I'm teaching is today I got up early and I did yoga and I went for a run. So I feel like licensed to have a donut after lunch. The idea being that because these Business Roundtable companies had gotten so much positive press for this, they felt like they were very responsible. And so cutting corners in their environmental and labor standards was totally fine. So anyway, so that was one of the events that got me thinking of the need to be much more skeptical of business and think about ways to put a much more critical lens on corporate sustainability.
The Business Roundtable is a great anchor here. So your first book looked at B Corps, companies trying to reform from within. And now with the Profiteers, your most recent book, you're making a much broader argument about how business operates. Take us through that arc. How did your research evolve from B Corps to this systemic critique that businesses privatize profits and socialize costs? And maybe break that down for us. What does that phrase actually mean in practice?
Sure. I appreciate you sort of noticing those books do fit together a bit, because sometimes people say, oh, my first book is called Better Business, and then this more recent one's called Profiteers. It's like seems very, very different, but actually they fit together, very, very well. In some ways, there's two sides of the same coin. So in the first book I did, really what I was trying to outline is how companies that actually really wanted to be authentically sustainable, how they could go about doing that. It has the B Corp in the title, and B Corps are companies that are certified for their social and environmental standards. And I'm a fan of like many B Corps, but some people are not a big fan, which, that's a topic for another conversation. But the focus of the book was not necessarily their company should or should not be B Corps, but actually when there is a collective that the B Lab is an NGO, and these entrepreneurs are working together to create, in some ways, alternative systems around accountability. So there is a variety of new tools and processes and measures for companies to really understand their social and environmental impact. Now, I think this is really important. I highlight this a bit more in the Profiteers because if you look at governments then holding companies accountable, actually they can stand on the shoulders of these sort of innovations and work private companies have done. So in some ways, private companies can detail what's possible, prove that it actually can be done, and that makes it easier for the policymakers to go about and implement it. So it's in some ways sort of both private and public sectors working complementary and iteratively as well. The other aspect is around governance, corporate governance, and changing laws around the standards and priorities of corporate governance. And this movement is actually working to create these new standards, tools, processes, which can be used by all companies. And I think that's something that I think we need. I mean, if we are going to actually try to create a more sort of sustainable, regenerative economics that acknowledges and respects planetary limits, we need to think about how businesses can be re-engineered, because maybe fossil fuel companies should be blown up and eliminated, but actually there's going to be large businesses no matter what. So I think thinking through how to change them. So that was sort of the focus of the first book. The second book, in some ways, is both a prequel and a sequel to Better Business. A prequel in the sense that it really tries to go deeper into the diagnoses of the systemic problems in our economy and why we need to be thinking about these different governance mechanisms. And part of what I do is, at a general level, look at how the neoliberal shareholder-first economic model got entrenched within U.S. corporate culture and society. It's not like this came down on tablets from heaven or something like that. I mean, this is a ideological program that has been in the works since, I don't know, in 30s or 40s, and really picked up steam in the 1970s and 80s. Before this, there was, some historians have called it the New Deal era, where there was much more Keynesian approach, and business was much more embedded within their communities. So what I try to do is look at some of the processes through which the neoliberal thinkers and policymakers got their ideas entrenched. And part of these were actually things like corporate governance measures, accountability processes. In the 1980s, there were court cases that decided in the US, and this has now spread like some sort of bad virus to the rest of the world, unfortunately, companies' basically sole responsibility is to deliver profits to shareholders. So this was actually needed to be decided in a court case. And another sort of thing that happened is there was the advent of stock options in stock option compensation, which, you know, if you look today at the CEO to average pay in companies, it's like between 300 and 400 to 1. If you look back 1970s, it was like 15 or 20 to 1. And the difference is in the 1980s, companies saw this idea of stock options as a way to really closely align their managers with short-term share price, and ever escalating spiral where, you know, if a CEO gets a certain amount of stock options, then all their friends want more, and then they want more and stuff. So anyway, so the prequel in that, I'm sort of diagnosing these systemic issues that have led to a lot of the problems we have around shareholder first, how it ended up happening. It's about revising assumptions around governance. The sequel part is then I try to look at how companies can be not just doing less harm, basically. The idea of sustainability, which is a very popular way that companies think about their responsibility. You know, the word sustain is not necessarily about making things better. It's about sort of keeping things as they are. And traditionally, the way companies think about their responsibilities is about doing less harm. And there's other examples, which I'm sure we can get to, around how companies are thinking about how they can have a net positive effect on their environments. And so how then, given the neoliberal problems, how can we reverse engineer those? Because with climate and inequality and all these problems, we need to try to look a little more forward in a positive way.
Right. So we've got this neoliberal system that allows or even encourages companies to externalize their costs. And you document this really clearly in the book. Pollution, depleted resources, rising inequality, all of these are costs that companies don't pay, but somebody has to. Walk us through how that works. What are some of the ways companies make these costs disappear from their balance sheets, and who ends up paying instead?
Sure. So, yeah. The subtitle to the Profiteers is how business privatizes profit and socializes cost. And so what I'm trying to get at is this idea of externality, which are in some ways economic, social spillovers from production that companies aren't responsible for. but the communities they're in or some other entity ends up bearing the brunt of those. So an easy example, which people probably would be familiar with, is carbon emissions. This is probably the most studied externality, most well-known. So companies in their factories pollute, put air pollution into the air. They are typically not charged for that. Now there's a variety of taxes and carbon tax and everything, but those are very spotty in how they're applied. There are a variety of, obviously, global warming effects. There are health impacts to the people that live close to those factories. So those are the externalities. They're negative effects from the companies to the society and the global commons due to the production. Now, a reasonable amount of study from economists and accountants to some extent of the topic of externalities, and a lot of different proposals and ideas put forth. Some of these I think are certainly very reasonable and helpful. Things like carbon taxes or even carbon markets, where there is some monetary value put to those externalities, whereby companies, there's a cost for them to pollute. So I think that is generally positive. However, understanding the broader social, ideological, cultural context helps really sort of unpack how insidious these are and why we should be thinking more about them. So just at a very simple level, what ends up getting seen as an externality is very socially constructed and politically constructed by interested actors. And the interested actors are corporations. Of course, if you're a company that for decades has been polluting for free, you want to continue that. Another sort of example around the carbon emissions line is under the Obama administration, there was a pretty detailed study done of the social cost of carbon. So this would then be when companies are bidding for government contracts or part of some government program, this externality would be priced in. And I think it was $42 a ton of carbon. After the Obama administration, Trump came in to be president, round one. And so he said, well, he didn't say, I don't know, some of his administration said, this $40 a ton, their oil company friends that are donating millions and millions of dollars don't like this, I'm sure. So they reduced it to like a couple dollars a ton. And this was done through just a very few assumptions. So one, there's like a discount rate for future impacts. So they change the discount rate so the future impacts get dramatically lowered. Not at all surprising sort of how both Trump 1 and Trump 2 have transpired. Just by changing a few assumptions, which were then very politically and ideologically motivated, you can see how this could actually change quite a bit. Just sort of fast forward the story, Biden comes in, changes it, I think it's $100 and something a ton. And then Trump's second term actually got rid of the whole idea entirely. So there's no sort of social cost for carbon under Trump administration too. Anyway, so one thing is I wanted to unpack how this political and ideological construction of externalities happens. And that one is pretty transparent, but a lot of them for fossil fuels, obviously we've talked a bit about plastics, other things like where companies are citing their most polluting factories that happen to be in African-American areas. And so these externalities end up getting both hidden from us and also disproportionately hitting certain populations versus others. And my final comment on this, there's a whole other part that I deal with in the book is, in general, we in the global north and more developed countries, so much of our lives actually are supported by lots of externalities in the global south. And this is very distant, and people are just not as aware of the fact that so much of the cheap things we have are because there's people that actually are working for below living wage and horrible environmental conditions. And those kind of externalities, I think, are important to be observing too. So, yeah, well, I'm going to stop there.
Completely. So companies have a vested interest in keeping those costs off the books, and they have the political power to make that happen. The social cost of carbon becomes whatever the administration says it is, right? This brings me to inequality, because we're seeing this play out in real time with wealth taxation in Europe. There's real momentum building for taxing extreme wealth more fairly, especially in France, but also to a lesser degree in the UK. From your perspective, how does that movement fit into what you're arguing in the Profiteers? Is taxing wealth another way of making those externalized costs visible?
Yeah, this is something that is really shocking to me, to be honest. I was pretty ignorant about it. I think that I've learned a lot, and I think that it's something that I think most people just really don't understand how tremendous the level of inequality is in our world, and and in particular how it is so dramatically increased as this neoliberal era has transpired. And I think in part there's been controversy in the US around these rich tech bro oligarchs have attached themselves to sort of Donald Trump. And conversely, the person who is running for mayor in New York, Zohan Mamdani, of saying there shouldn't be billionaires. And so this has sort of come up, a lot in the public discussion. I think one reason why people don't realize this is that as the rich get richer, they're able to sort of pull themselves away from society into much more exclusive and set aside enclaves or a yacht or whatever. And so we don't realize actually how rich the rich are. And we need to be thinking about this in some ways as an externality. I mean, these are essentially human rights abuses that we are putting up with in the world in order for us to have basically cheap and plentiful products. So I think this is one aspect of it. But also, if you look at some of the economic research, this is like the OECD and the IMF have some things. As economic inequality increases, GDP, generally goes down. Of course, there's lots of critiques of using GDP as a good measure, which we can talk about regarding degrowth. But I think that is one way to think about the negative consequences of these externalities, and that, as the rich get richer, the whole society is worse off, let alone that there can be more political concentration and, rising authoritarian tendencies because power becomes more concentrated. I think there's a whole other sort of subversion of democracy issue, but there is also a big economic issue too.
Right. So inequality itself is an externality. More billionaires represents a social cost, not a benefit. And this gets at something bigger, which is in part why I wanted to talk with you today. Because when you start connecting all these threads, externalities, inequality, resource limits, you end up at degrowth. And that's where a lot of people shut down. As you know, this is what we're trying to shift with this podcast, trying to make degrowth something we can actually discuss. And your HBR piece does this really well. You break down the myths that block people from engaging. Walk us through those and tell us what the misconceptions are that make degrowth feel impossible or scary to people.
Sure. I go back and forth on whether the term degrowth is good or not. I think that it's sort of jarring. I mean, at the end of the day, I think we need cultural and cognitive change, and actually jarring is potentially necessary. So, but on the other hand, it does create a lot of, there's a lot of resistance to it. To your point about the article I wrote, and one of the reasons why I wrote that, and it actually comes from some of the arguments in the book, The Profiteers, relating to how companies are shaping people's expectations about what is possible or not in a way that is to their self-interest. So the idea that there's going to be this green growth and innovation that sort of saves us from all the problems with climate change, if people believe that, then they're not going to realize that we're sprinting to some cliff. What I talked about earlier with the Business Roundtable saying they're going to do green innovation. There's so much promotion of these technologies like, carbon capture that are really questionable as to whether they're ever going to be deployable. In many ways, just as a backdrop, one of the reasons why I wrote this is that I think whether you believe in degrowth or not, whether you think it's crazy to think whatever, I mean, I think we need to just be intellectually honest that what we are being sold as a way to address climate change is just bullshit. Sorry for sharing on your podcast, but yeah. So I mentioned this sort of green innovation is a fallacy. Also, this idea of decoupling in energy transition literature, that it will be possible to decouple carbon emissions and economic growth is a fallacy. Also, all this news that solar and wind are getting, it doesn't mean necessarily that all this coal, all this dirty fossil fuel driven energy is going offline. It actually is not. So there's not an energy transition. That's another one. I mean, things have flattened out a bit in certain countries, but if you look around the globe, so many countries are in their very, very intense growth phase, which they certainly should have a right to do, given it seems, fundamentally unfair if we in the global north say, oh, we were able to burn all this carbon and grow. And sorry, you have to stop growing. So that seems fundamentally unfair. So there is this idea of this, we need to come to terms with the fact that growth and carbon emissions are closely tied together. And then also the third one is around efficiency and relates to this paradox called the Jevons paradox, also known as the rebound effect. So this guy, Jevons, it was back in the early days of industrial revolution, he observed that in the early steam engines, as things got more efficient, it's not as if people ended up using less, but actually it just led to actually cheaper products, so they ended up using more. And so this is something that happens that as things are getting more efficient, they get more cheaper, and then more of them get used. So actually it ends up leading, in some cases, to more carbon emissions. So anyways, those are three: the sort of myth of the energy transition, myth of efficiency, and a myth of innovation are the three things I talked about in that article.
Right, those myths really do block the conversation. But once you work through them, I find that you're left with even harder questions. Here's one I struggle with, and feel free to take this wherever makes sense. The energy piece. Because we're told the solution is transitioning to renewables, building out clean energy infrastructure. And sure, that's necessary. But if we're serious about degrowth, we're also talking about using less energy overall, rethinking consumption. I'm curious to hear how you think about that. Is the renewable energy transition the right frame for this conversation? Or are there other interventions, regulation, limits on extraction that you think matter more?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I have a good answer for that. I mean, I do think that I'm a fan of renewable energy, although it seems the U.S. is now sort of supporting coal and canceling wind projects. So we're sort of going backwards. But I think so. So to me, in part, what needs to be done is there needs to be much more scrutiny and policy levers to address fossil fuel companies. Some people don't like to think this is too simplistic to put it, but if you look at carbon emissions over the last 30 years, 3/4 of them are from 100 companies. They have a lot of very tricky ways of trying to stay in business. So one of which is promoting these things like carbon capture and other things that say, we'll be able to continue burning fossil fuels, but we'll be able to capture that carbon. Another is that, and this is partially true, is that actually so much of the expertise and human capital works for fossil fuel companies. And so they will tell this story that actually they're very well suited to make this transition because they actually have this human capital expertise. But I mean, they've had this for decades and they haven't done anything except undermine our collective good. So I wouldn't hold much stock in what they say.
Oh yeah, for sure. So fossil fuel companies have basically designed a system that protects their business model. And when it comes to carbon capture and offsets, it's all about keeping the extraction going. I think we've mapped the problem pretty well. We know who benefits, we know how the system perpetuates itself, but now I'd like to zoom out even further before we get to solutions. What are the deeper assumptions that we're working with, the ideas about growth, progress, value? What are the mental models that lock us into this system? And perhaps more importantly, what new frameworks are out there that could actually shift how we think about this?
Yeah, good question. I do think the legal responsibility of companies, I think, is something that is important. And there are a variety of new frameworks that exist to try to hold the companies legally accountable for broader sets of, for lack of a better word, stakeholders. I mean, I think the EU, they have this CSDDD and CSRD, Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, are a step along that process. Unfortunately, from what I understand, while those had very thoughtful and ambitious original scoping, actually finance sector and other interested actors end up watering them down substantially. I do think that sort of a reconstruction of the laws around corporate responsibility are very important. We haven't talked, I'm just going to say, I mean, they're not going to fit exactly to what you want. Hopefully that'll be the case. So one is changing the legal framework and responsibility through which corporations are held accountable and act. Another that we have not talked about, but I see as a big root cause of a lot of the issues that exist, are the financial markets. I'm not sure how to rewire financial markets, but I do think we have the sort of financialization of things has taken over much of the governance of companies. I think that is something that needs to be unraveled. Another root cause that is really important to be thinking about is our own cultural assumptions. And I think that in the US in particular, which is the context I know the best, even though I'm at Cambridge, I'm American and lived most of my life, and still a lot of my research is in the US, is that there's just the cultural assumption that companies exist to deliver short-term profits, and actually they get almost respected more for tricking the public. Oh, they're very smart and sort of overly stated. Gordon Gekko in the movie Wall Street, 1980s movie, this financier's big speech about greed is good. And that, I think, is emblematic of, it was done at this sort of turning point where the neoliberal model was really taking over. And it's interesting because Oliver Stone, the director, he wrote that character as someone that should be, reviled. It turns out he is a hero in America. So originally written as a villain, but actually this statement and who he is turned into being a hero. So anyways, more stringent laws around companies. Somehow we need to do something with the financial markets. And then at the end, it sort of is about changing cultural assumptions and expectations. It's why I write about this and I try to write about the public sphere. I mean, I'm doing very, very little amount, but it takes a lot of people doing a lot of different things. It's not like there's any sort of silver bullets here. I mean, you need to each be doing our part if we believe that the system needs to be changed.
Absolutely. And that's the long game, right? Changing those cultural stories one conversation at a time until the day that Gordon Gekko isn't the hero anymore. Listen, I know we're running up against time here, but I like to end on a more hopeful note, because in the Profiteers, you don't just critique, you also point to companies that are actually trying to do this differently, to redefine what a regenerative business looks like. Are there examples that stick with you that you'd like to share? Companies that embody that shift in assumptions we've been talking about?
I'll say a little. I mean, I hate to use Patagonia as an example because they always get trotted out as sort of this sustainability example. But I think here it's worth actually going back to them because, Patagonia, if you look before 2015 or 16, their mission statement had something in it like do as little harm as possible, something like that. And spent a reasonable amount of time interviewing some of the leaders there. And what I was told that actually at some point they realized that they're a company where the owners of the business and the company, really are, I think, genuinely committed to environmental issues. And they said they realized actually in their mission statement, they're admitting that they basically harm the world. And this sent them on a very long journey to understand production systems and consumer impact. And one of the things that was happening that actually was very influential in their thinking was they got into the food business. And sort of agriculture, if done in a thoughtful way, by actually growing crops that we then eat, you can restore soil and lead to greater biodiversity in the ecosystem. And then obviously there's the human ecology part where there's spillovers to people. So they realized actually through agriculture, they could end up potentially having a net positive effect. And this led them to think about their apparel business, which is a challenging business for them because, one, it is consumption oriented, and two, it's a challenge because they also have quality and long life as a core element of their ethos. And even then, I mean, these products still have negative impact on the environment. Some still have to use fossil fuels. And so what they said is that the new mission statement is we're in business to save our home planet. And after this, it's been well reported, so the ownership of Patagonia is not investors, it's not even employees. It's actually, there's a foundation trying to do this sort of regenerative giving back positively. There's a recent book that came out about the founder of Patagonia. And what he says at the end is that 50 years from now, he hopes Patagonia is mainly a food company because he feels that as a food company that is doing regenerative agriculture, it's much closer to the mission of saving the earth than an apparel company. So that's sort of one example.
That's fantastic. I'll definitely be keeping an eye out for the day Patagonia sells more vegetables than it does jackets. Okay, final question. We've talked about companies, about changing assumptions, about cultural shifts, but let's talk about movements. You mention this piece of research in the book that systematic change typically happens when around 3.5% of the population gets involved. That's it. Not a majority, just 3.5%. In your opinion, where do you think we are between the US and the UK, the places you know best? How close are we to that threshold? And are you optimistic that we can reach it?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm a relatively optimistic person, although the challenges are tremendous in our world today. And so it's hard to imagine culture changing in a way that actually leads to more effective policy and alters corporate behavior. And I think that's because just when you're in the system, so to speak, things are very taken for granted. They look very natural. But lots of things have changed over time in regards to just in the US, two things that when I was growing up that I never would have thought that I'd see. So legalization of marijuana and gay marriage. I would have bet every single cent that I have that neither of those things, I mean, just seems so intractable and impossible for those things to happen as the cultural change happens. And I mentioned this idea of the 70s or so is when neoliberalism really gained ground after lots of intellectual work earlier. So I do think that the pendulum is swinging back. I think the Trump administration is trying as hard as it can to push against many of these topics like, climate change and diversity and inequality, that the strength of that counter movement in some ways potentially is an indication that it was gaining traction. That's, I guess, sort of a glass half full way to think about the current political environment. But I can't predict, to be honest. If you'd asked me 2 years ago, I would have been a little more optimistic. But it was just a climate week, actually. I mean, it was the largest New York climate week ever. The amount of passion and energy and excitement around creating new models of sustainability, regeneration, transforming ecosystems. I mean, it's palpable. I mean, I think the political environment in the US is such that the media is covering all of these controversies, and I think there's a tremendous amount of work being done on the ground to actually push forward these ideas. And so I do see lots of optimism still.
I'm glad to hear you're optimistic. We definitely need it. Listen, Professor Marquis, thank you so much for this conversation. I think we covered a lot of ground. And honestly, I hope this sends people straight to the Profiteers to dig deeper into all of this. Before we wrap, where can people follow your work beyond the book? Where should they look if they want to stay connected to what you're doing?
Sure, they can certainly follow me on LinkedIn. I'm relatively active trying to say what I'm doing and what I'm publishing. I have a website, which is just my name, chrismarquis.com, which has lots of email. And I do have a Substack, which I try to regularly publish on around this idea of regeneration. I mean, a lot of it at this point is reading lots of news and research on the topic. And so I put together weekly various summaries of sort of things I'm seeing in the news, in research, hope to be building more on that. But that's another place people can find me.
Thank you for listening to the Empty World podcast. If this conversation sparked something for you, feel free to reach out. I'm always curious to hear what lands with people, and you'll find useful links in the show notes. There's more episodes coming with exciting guests, and I hope you'll join me for it. Take care.